any content on the web to be able to read responses from your site. It's a allow everyone permission. And it can create problems when it's on internal networks or used when they're not needed or not scoped properly. So they're not always evil. There are certain use cases where you do actually want to specify star in the cross-domain policy file, but they tend to be very limited, and people tend to misapply it because the rules around being able to do that are so specific that people overlook things. For instance, you wouldn't want to set this on a site that has login that you have to log into. You wouldn't want to set it for an entire domain. You would probably only want to set it for a subdirectory within your domain. But there are certain cases where maybe you're posting the NASDAQ results for the day. And the NASDAQ results are all public results. Everyone's allowed to read it. So if you're at NASDAQ, you might post up an XML file with the closing stock prices of the day. And you do really intend to share that XML data with the rest of the world so that finance websites can pull in that XML and do neat graphs when you go to the finance websites and track your stocks. In that case, they may want to intentionally share all that data with the world, but you just need to be careful about when you apply it. And sometimes people will go, okay, well, I won't do a full wildcard. They'll do a subdomain. They'll do star.mybestfriend.org. And I'll just trust everything that's on that particular domain, and then I'm not doing a full wildcard. The problem with that is that you have to really know what that other site's doing. For instance, Jeremiah Grossman developed this attack against Google where YouTube provided cross-domain permissions to their site to star.google.com because Google had bought YouTube, and so Google was a trusted partner, so they put star.google.com. The problem was that there were certain subdomains within Google where you could upload content. And so what Jeremiah Grossman figured out was he could send himself an email with an attachment to gmail.google.com. I don't have these domains exactly right, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm sort of rounding them off. And that would get his attachment on a subdomain of Google. So now that he had that attachment on the subdomain of Google, if he could get a victim who was a YouTube user to visit his website, and he sourced in that Swift from google.com, now he's got content that he's running and that he controls that runs under the context of google.com. And you'll remember earlier I had said that the domain of the Swift is the domain of where it's hosted, not who's loading it in. So even though the web page is eviltohacker.org, since that attachment was hosted on google.com, the Swift still considers itself to be google.com. And since YouTube has an allow access from star.google.com, that Swift was now able to reach into YouTube and make requests and see the response data that came back. And then, of course, once it was able to collect that data, they could send it back to the hacker who started it. And so what he did is he was able to go through and collect what your username was on YouTube by doing requests to the web pages through Crosssite request forgery, see what your favorite videos are with YouTube that was associated with your account. And so it was just sort of an example that wildcards, even when specified as subdomains, could be a risk if one of those subdomains allowed user-uploaded content, because then the content's executing within that domain. And when you get those response bodies back, you may not, those response bodies may contain sensitive information. Like, for instance, in the Flash world, we don't allow access to the headers of the response. We just allow access to the response body. And people sometimes have the misconception that, oh, well, then they don't have access to the cookies. But they never really look at the architecture of their site and realize that things like JSession IDs sometimes get echoed back in URLs within the page. And then, even though they didn't have access to the JSession ID as a cookie, they get access to the JSession ID when it gets reflected back as a GET parameter on the URL. So these are things that you really have to think about when you're allowing cross-domain access. But moving forward, sort of looking ahead to the future attacks, now that we have these multiple cross-domain permissioning systems, it's possible for there to be the idea of transitive cross-domain permissions. And that means if Site A has access to Site B and Site B has access to Site C, then it may be possible that Site A has access to Site C. And if you're a business partner, let's say you're site A, and you're providing those cross-domain permissions to site B, you may not be realizing that they are also providing other cross-domain permissions to their site. And so it becomes difficult for someone to get a holistic view of how much they're exposing on the web. So when people provide cross-domain permissions, they really need to think about how they're deploying them. And I actually do have some sample attacks here, that one of which actually occurred in the wild just recently. So one of the attacks that's been talked about, and I know Jesse's written about it on MSDN, is the ability to create or mix cross-site scripting with cross-site request forgery. I'm not really good with coming up with attack names, so I just sort of mixed stuff together and threw jacking at the end of it.
I like it. Works for me.
Works for you? Okay. So let's say you have the objective of stealing user data from sensitive.org. But sensitive.org knows they're a sensitive site. They've done a lot of hardening. You're not finding any good vulnerabilities on their website. But you know that sensitive.org provides XHR2 cross-domain permissions to another website. So they have one other person that they trust to be able to read their data. Well, what you could do is, if you can find a cross-site scripting vulnerability on the site that they share cross-domain permissions with, on victim.org, then you're able to leverage that permission to get into sensitive.org, because you cross-site script into victim.org, you're now executing under victim.org's context, security context, and from there you can go ahead and you can reach in to sensitive.org, leveraging the cross-domain permissions that have been granted to that domain. So this might be good, for instance, for phishing attacks, where maybe going after bankofamerica.com is too obvious, but maybe you can link to some other website and cross your way in there. Another attack that occurred in the wild was mixing Flash content with AJAX cross-domain permissions, where the attacker had the objective of stealing data from a website, and sensitive, that website had good security, but again, they had AJAX permissions set up. So with Swift content, what you might be able to do is, if you have an allow script access permission of always, then the Swift can reach into the DOM of that hosting HTML page and execute under the context of example.org. And this actually can occur in more places than you think. For instance, it's very common to provide allow script access equals always permissions on ad networks, because that allows to provide more interactive ads, where maybe the Swift is floating over the web page and following you whenever you scroll, or if you've seen the peel down ads where there's like a little tear that's flipped over in the top right hand corner. If you mouse over it, the page peels back to show you the ad behind it. Typically, a lot of those type of ads tend to have allow script access equals always permissions. And occasionally, it happens that the ad networks aren't able to screen all the malicious Swifts out of the ad networks. And we've seen in the past where, while they're able to screen out a vast majority of them, every so often one slips through under the radar and gets through. So from that perspective, you can use the Swift to jump across domains into that DOM, and then use the AJAX permission to go out to the web page. So just to give you a real-life example of that, there's a social networking site called RenRen, and it's a Chinese website which is similar to Facebook. It's for Chinese students and allows them to share videos and information with each other. It's a social networking site. And I'll just go directly into the example here. What the attackers found is that when you shared a video on the RenRen site, that shared video, that YouTube video, would be provided with an allow script access equals always permission. So what they would do is they start by sending a victim a message saying, hey, go watch this Pink Floyd video. And the Pink Floyd video was run by a Swift that was hosted on evil.org website. And RenRen, when they linked to that video on that evil.org website, was mistakenly saying allow script access equal to always. By default, on Flash content, allow script access is set to the same domain, but in this case, they were changing the default to set it to always when linking to video content. So what the Swift would do is it would play a pink void